I'm going to delve today into some new material that I've discovered. These are clues that have to do with two of Mathew Franklin Whittier's plagiarists. Of course, Mathew was myself in the 19th century. And one of these is famous. That's Margaret Fuller, the supposed Transcendentalist. And the second is obscure, but I've talked about him quite a bit, Francis Durivage. So we're going back to the 19th century, and we're going to dig deeply into this history. And I have to add the caveat once more that this is a vast tapestry of evidence that all fits together. That took me 13 years to ferret out. And any one little clue is not going to prove this to any skeptical people. And even the smoking guns, which should, pique their interest at the very least, don't seem to faze them because they're in denial and they just bat it away. Every single piece of evidence, instead of putting it all together as I have into a tapestry, they try to shoot down each individual piece. Well, it's not rational, but then human beings by and large aren't rational, so join the club. But anyway, we're going to delve into these things. I'm going to have to go very closely by my notes because this is going to get pretty complex, both of these. So first we're going to look at what scholars have said about Francis Durivage, because I'm not the only one who's determined that he was a plagiarist, okay? So the first instance that I have found, which was part of his later life, will go in that order of what I discovered. It's in an article called Some Aspects of Pioneer California Journalism by one J.M. Scanlon. And it's in The Bookman, an illustrated magazine of literature and life. This is volume 23, the March 1906 through August 1906 edition. It's found on page 44. I just found a copy of this online, an original copy of this book for $11. So, I can afford $11, so I went ahead and bought it for my collection. So I'm going to read what this fellow has to say about Francis Durivage. It's not well cited, so I don't know exactly where he gets his information. So I have to say that this falls into the category of journalistic gossip. Okay, so be clear about that. Nonetheless, he says, salaries were large in those days of gold. He's talking about gold prospecting and so on in Western journalism. And the newspaper field was especially inviting. Men, quote, drifted into journalism as they do now, and many of them also knew as little about it. There were also, quote, fakers in the land. The most amusing incident that has been handed down in the history of Pacific Slope journalism is that of the then much heralded, quote, brilliant paragraphist Francis A. Durivage, who was imported by the Alta. He had drifted from New York to New Orleans, where he was trying to hold down a desk on the Picayune. Now, I have to stop here because Mathew Franklin Whittier spent 2 summers writing for the Daily Delta in New Orleans in 1846 and 1847. So whether they had any contact there, we don't know. During the absence of editor Lumsden, Durivage, quote, exploited the editor's own scrapbook, in which there were witty sayings and bits of humor, which the editor had written not necessarily for publication, but for use at private receptions and at clubs. Durivage, quote, worked these over and used them as original with himself. This bold plagiarism from the editor himself resulted in Durivage's, quote, resignation. He then drifted to San Francisco and was employed on the Alta as a star writer. Here he worked over those same paragraphs filched from editor Lumsden's desk. The Picayune exposed him, and the, quote, star paragraphist fell from his false pedestal. Now, I don't have a whole lot of history on Francis Durivage, but what I know of him was that he grew up in Boston, he lived in Boston, and he became the associate editor of Ballew's Pictorial under Martyr and Ballew. I don't know anything about him going to New Orleans, and I don't know anything about him going west. So this is all very strange. I wish I had, a little more in terms of citation and a background and a trail to follow here. But anyway, unless they've got the name completely wrong, which I doubt, there's apparently some dirt here on Francis Durivage as a plagiarist. Now, the one that I have that actually goes back to his time as a young man in Boston is the one that I found very recently. It's in Literary Banglings, Addenda to the Holmes, this is Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., Addenda to the Holmes Bibliography by Eleanor M. Tilton. And it's in, quote, The Papers of the Bibliographic Society of America, volume 51, first quarter, 1957. And she says, here one might add, she's talking about Oliver Wendell Holmes' early pieces with different signatures. Here one might add that these explorations of the newspapers reveal the justice of Holmes's complaints of imitators whose copying led him to write, quote, the last leaf, or poem, in a form that would instantly disclose the imitator. A ballad in the Columbian Centinel of October 30, 1830, is a bad copy of Old Ironsides, and a poet signing himself F.A.D., that's Francis Alexander Durivage, has a series of badly done steals from Holmes in the same paper between September 8 and November 10, 1830. F.A.D., whom she hadn't identified, ultimately sneaks into the Galaxy, that's the New England Galaxy that Mathew first published in when he was 12 years old, ultimately sneaks into the Galaxy on December 10, 1830, after the tandem of Holmes and Sargent had left it. One of F.A.D.'s lucubrations purloins the subject of, quote, the last leaf. So we have two scholars here labeling Francis Durivage as an imitator and a plagiarist. Now, we have a story that I just recently found by Francis Durivage, signed F.A.D. It's in the Philadelphia Album and Ladies Literary Gazette, and it's the October 30, 1830 edition. Now, this Centinel font that they quote apparently was the Columbian Centinel. I think it's the same newspaper. I've got somebody hopefully looking that up for me. But apparently he has plagiarized, parodied, and imitated one of Mathew's own pieces. Now, Mathew Franklin Whittier was writing for and editing the New York Constellation, and here's the history of that. When he left home at age 12, he went to Boston, and he had, apparently before he even ran away from home, he had been successfully submitting material to the New England Galaxy in Boston. That was a major literary newspaper there. And then he ran away from home, and apparently the editor, Joseph T. Buckingham, took him under his wing and mentored him. And Joseph T. Buckingham had a son who was 2 years older than Mathew, named Edwin. And Edwin was placed in charge of the New England Galaxy because Joseph T. Buckingham was editing the daily paper, The Courier. And I gather, reading between the lines, that Mathew was a star at age 12. He was brilliant. He was a literary prodigy. And Buckingham kind of adopted him and made Edwin terribly jealous because of Mathew's talent and because of the special attention he was getting from Edwin's father. So Edwin hated him, see? And I think that Edwin and Francis Durivage teamed up. So in this story that I'm going to show you in a minute, called The Long Man by Durivage, which was a parody of something Mathew had just published in the Constellation, I think that the other person in that, the other character, Tom, is actually young Edwin Buckingham, I'm guessing. So anyway, Mathew wrote for the New England Galaxy. He went to New York City. He wrote, he inaugurated the Yankee dialect style of humor in America with Joe Strickland in 1825, 1826, and on for a few years. He wrote that for the New York Enquirer, New York National Advocate, and then the New York Enquirer when the editor established his own paper. He went, and those pieces got reprinted in the Galaxy, so there was a connection there between those New York papers and the Galaxy. And then Mathew went back home and worked for a little while with his brother as a shoemaker, and then he ran away from home for the last time at age 14. And apparently he was writing, possibly working at the Courier, I think, under Joseph T. Buckingham, and he was writing for the New England Galaxy. Buckingham owned both of those papers. So eventually he left, and he left when Asa Green, who was the editor of the Berkshire American in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, Asa Green moved to New York City, established the New York Constellation in late 1829. In late 1829, Mathew moved up to New York City, began writing for the Constellation under Asa Green, and by mid-1830, Mathew was the de facto editor of that paper. There's a lot of background to that. I can't prove that here today. Okay, that would take us 3 or 4 hours. But that's the situation. Now we go to this story written by Francis Durivage for the Centinel, reprinted in the Philadelphia album. This is the 1830 Philadelphia album. And reprinted from the Boston Centinel, we have a piece signed F.A.D. called The Long Man, a legend from the South End. I've got to bring my light down and pump it up a little bit here. Sorry about the aesthetics once again. It's pretty small type they used. He's got a quote in Latin, which I won't attempt to translate. If you will grant me a patient half-hour's perusal, I will endeavor to give you all the information extant respecting a horrible apparition which about a year ago terrified the inhabitants of the South End and was generally known by the appellation of the Long Man. I had been long conversant with all the spectres and bores perambulating this part of the city, in which I have always taken an intense interest. This portion of the metropolis, even up to a very late period, preserved its fine antique dwelling houses and so on. So you get a sense of the writing style there. Now, my knowledge of this unhappy being occurred in the following manner. It was a bleak, rainy night in December, and not having seen Tom for a fortnight, I mustered up sufficient courage to brave the elemental warfare without, and wrapping myself in my cloak, wended my solitary way down Washington Street to the Lamb Tavern. Tom had stepped out for a few moments, and I had dried myself in the blaze of a tremendous oak-wood fire when Tom entered the apartment. I was struck with his ghastly and woebegone air. He silently took my hand, shook it, seated himself, and gazing for a few moments into the fire, fell into a torrent of tears. I was inexpressibly affected. Tom, cried I, you have been doing something desperate. You haven't been fool enough to fall in love. Not such a blockhead, answered Tom with a faint smile. But, added he after a pause, I've seen the Sponday gentleman tonight. Sponday? Aye, replied he. He's like a spondy, for he's too long, 6 feet 10 by this hand. Perhaps I am right in conjecturing that you are unacquainted with the history of a monster who has struck a terror to the hearts of all the smokers in the South End? Listen, then, and be enlightened. About a week ago, as I was sitting half asleep over a pint of Pearl in the last novel, the waiter showed in a long, thin man in black, who appeared to be a relic of the ancient race of giants. Words are inadequate to express my astonishment at this tremendous freak of nature. It was exactly 3 minutes and 15 seconds before I could bring myself to believe that the being before me lived and breathed and had existence like myself. As it was impossible for the monster to preserve his perpendicularity, he lay along the floor, and his frame, extended in this posture, was ghastly beyond imagination. That's Mathew Franklin Whittier that he's hatefully describing here. Okay, Mathew was 6'2", as I understand, probably reached his full height very young. So even when he was 14 at this time, he was probably 6'2". So you can see that whoever Tom is and Francis Durivage hated Mathew. Let's go on a little bit. I soon discovered that the animal was a gentleman of property who had emigrated hither from New York and had brought letters to me from a friend in the latter city. Of course, it was expected that I should show him every civility, and so on and so forth. So they really just make terrible fun. And the only thing that actually happens in this story is that the protagonist, after learning about the Long Man, has an encounter with him where the Long Man, smoking cigar, passes him on the street. Well, Mathew had insomnia and apparently used to walk late at night in the streets of Boston. So they must have had an encounter, and he turned it into this. A few weeks after this adventure, Tom called upon me one morning. The adventure was passing him in the street. In high spirits and with a heart beating high with joy, informed me that the long man had departed from the city for New York. He had seen him in the Providence stage, and so forth and so on. So he finishes by saying, at a late meeting of the club, it was unanimously resolved that in case of another visit of the cigar vampire, all grocer men should be warned that, on their indulging the inhuman propensities of the savage by selling him cigars, the patronage of all civilized Christians will be withdrawn forever, F-A-D. In other words, he's an extortionist, and he's no Christian, trust me. It's mean, it's mean and it's purposeless. There's nothing that this tall person has done other than to be tall and smoke cigars to earn their hatred by this anyway. So now let's look at what he plagiarized from. Again, I'm putting some things together, but I have way more evidence than what I'm able to present here. For example, that Mathew was in fact in New York writing for the Constellation and editing the Constellation and so on. This is unsigned. I know by style that this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's work. Again, I could prove that, but it would take another 3 hours to do it. This is called the Street Spectre, and I'll just read a little way into it. A most singular looking being may be seen every morning before daybreak in the streets of this city, known by the name of the Street Spectre. We do not mean the street inspector, who, as far as we are informed, is a very quiet gentleman and would not think of being so uncivil as to rise before the god of day. Besides, there is no such resemblance between a well-fed citizen and the shadowy being whom we are about to describe, as that the one should be mistaken for the other. The street spectre is a tall, gaunt, grizzled, woe-begone figure with a cadaverous countenance, curved body, bent knees, and long, crooked fingers. He carries constantly with him a large sack of a dark, ashy hue, into which he seems forever to be putting something or other which he apparently picks up in the street. He seems to be in some measure endowed with the power of ubiquity, and may be seen almost at the same moment in every street from Bloomingdale to the Battery, constantly employed in filling his sack and anxiously looking about on every side to see that nothing is left that should be gathered up. From these characteristics he has, by common consent, obtained the name of the Street Spectre. Now this is a type, or kind of a principle. This is not a real person that Matthew's describing, so far as I know. If you go into it, he begins telling a bizarre tale and kind of brings metaphysics into it. Now, Abby was teaching him metaphysics by this time, and he kind of didn't totally buy all of it, especially the cult side, the woo-woo side of it, but he would bring it into his humor. He would use it as grist for the mill for his humor. Let me go ahead and read a good bit of this because I haven't marked out particular parts I should focus on, just to give you a feel for what we've got. So singular a looking being, so almost everywhere present and so employed, could not fail to attract general notice, and nobody pretends to dispute the existence of the street spectre. But it has for a long time been a matter of wonder with many. What can it be that he is forever so industriously gathering from the streets and depositing in his bag? Some suppose he is in search of rags and bits of paper, which he may sell to the rag dealers for a penny a pound. Others believe he is employed by the corporation, apparently that's a city corporation, to clean the streets, and that he makes use of his sack as a vehicle for conveying away the filth and rubbish. But neither of these suppositions is the right one. The street spectre is one of those supernatural beings who are employed to transport to their place of future abode the souls or spirits of such of the inferior animals as have died the day previous, viz., those of monkeys, dogs, cats, rats, pigs, parrots, mockingbirds, etc., the carcasses of which are seen adorning the gutters the next morning. Now note how much better the writing is, than the knockoff that Francis Durivage wrote. And he's got a point here. This is, a philosophical piece because Mathew was a philosopher. He says, now this is something that Abby had been trying to teach him. My first psychic said that they studied reincarnation. Here is evidence that Matthew was aware of reincarnation, not that he accepted it, because he didn't until maybe 30 years later, or 20 years later, rather. In 1850, I think he started taking it seriously. At this point, he did not. However, we can see that he was exposed to it. We shall not here enter into the inquiry whether the Pythagorean doctrine of the transmigration of souls be true, or whether the doctrine commonly received among us that brutes have no souls be the more correct, but shall, for the purpose of the present story, proceed on the charitable and at least harmless supposition that the inferior animals as well as the human species are endowed with an immortal part. So Matthew had been thinking over this question, because Christianity officially said that animals had no souls, which made it very convenient to slaughter them for food and be cruel to them in other ways. These disembodied spirits are crammed together into the same capacious sack and borne away by the street spectre to the dwellings provided for them, which are supposed by the latest philosophers to be situated in the interior regions denominated Sim's Hole. But the soul of a biped without feathers, as Plato defined man, has through mistake occasionally been huddled into the same bag along with the rest, much to the annoyance of the regular passengers, who feel themselves degraded by the presence of some of those spirits which once inhabited a human form. So the animals feel degraded by the humans. See? So what he's doing here, this is a little dig about dandies. Well, remember that Mathew Franklin Whittier was raised Quaker. He was still, at least officially, a Quaker at this point in his life. And Quakers use plain speech. They wear plain clothes. And the antithesis of a Quaker, especially in a big city like New York, would be a dandy. Okay, so he makes fun of dandies. But the street spectre has been so long engaged in the same occupation that he has attained a remarkable degree of accuracy, and now very rarely makes a mistake, except in taking the soul of a drunkard for that of a swine, of a scold for that of a Paul parrot, or of a dandy for that of a monkey. When, however, a mistake of this kind does occur, there is no rectifying it, for like all persons who have grown gray in a particular employment, or who value themselves on their correctness in doing business, the street spectre will not have his accuracy doubted, and only draws closer the string of his sack upon any turbulent spirit that dares to claim exemption on the plea of belonging to the human species. This is what I'm finding with academia, with editors of scholarly journals. They are loath to admit that they've been wrong. And if I'm right about these famous works that I believe Matthew and Abby were the authors of, then they've been horrifically and embarrassingly wrong. See, and they won't admit it any more than the street spectre will admit he's picked up a human soul. But notwithstanding his general accuracy, he made not long since a most disastrous blunder, and there is strong reason to believe that his eyesight is failing, or possibly he is in league with the enemies of that persecuted race called dandies. He had completed his load and was bearing it swiftly away when a voice was heard from the interior of the sack. Let me out, mingled at the same time with the growling of dogs, the spitting of cats, the yelling of monkeys, the grunting of swine, and the chattering of parrots, and so on. You get a sense of where this is going. You can see how clever this was, the philosophical background and depth that it had, the humor that it had, and the fact that it was not attacking any particular human being. Francis Durivage took that, dashed off, because he had to have written it pretty quickly, dashed off a vicious parody which impugned Mathew Franklin Whittier hatefully, and got it published in the Centinel, which was then picked up in the Philadelphia Album. As far as I can tell, this much superior piece, even though the Philadelphia Album did print quite a bit of Matthew's work in it, his didn't get printed in there. Only Francis Durivage's horrible imitation got printed in there. So that's the first thing that I discovered. The second thing I discovered in the Philadelphia Album was a dialogue. And Matthew did write these dialogues, fanciful dialogues, philosophical, social commentary, and so on. And I'll give you a couple examples in a minute. This is called Jail and Bridewell, and it's reprinted from the New York Constellation, the same period. We know that Matthew wrote it by style and by the fact that he was editing and writing for this paper. And this is a dialogue between the jail and Bridewell, apparently, and I'm writing to the Historical Society in New York City to try to get a little more information on this. The city hall had two wings, and one wing was like a city jail, and the other wing was called Bridewell. So apparently the city hall had two wings. I'll show here on the screen. And one side was the city jail. Maybe people had just been arrested and were being held for trial. That would be on that side. The other side was called Bridewell, and that was where you did your time. So that's what I gather. I may be enlightened on that if the Historical Society writes me back. But this is a supposed argument between the jail and Bridewell. Well, this is how Mathew sets it up. He says, "We know not whether there be any truth in the strange story of a confab reported to have taken place a while ago between these two ornaments of our city." The title is Jail and Bridewell. "And yet we do not see why such a thing might not happen. For if we may believe the records of history, both sacred and profane, dumb creatures have spoken, and things without life, on some very extraordinary occasions, have been endowed with utterance of speech, and talked like very oracles." These are things that Abbey had been sharing with him that, again, he wasn't totally on board with, but he would use it in his humorous writing. "But it is a moot point whether the two piles which adorn the wings of the park and stand on each side of the city hall, as it were the handmaids of justice, winking at her acknowledged blindness, are in reality inanimate bodies." So there's a lot of satire in here now. "Certain it is, however destitute of motion, life, and feeling they may be in themselves, there is in them a degree of animation by no means to be expected from their external appearance." And he goes on that they ended up in an argument, and I'll quote a little bit of their discussion. Dame Bridewell began, "I understand it is in contemplation to remove us from the pleasant situation we have so long occupied in this goodly park to some remote corner of the city." Jail says, "Indeed?" Bridewell, "So it is reported. And what do you think is the alleged cause?" Jail says, "Why, truly, as far as it regards myself, I cannot guess. That our neighbors, however, should be desirous to rid themselves of your company, I do not think at all strange." Bridewell, "Upon my conscience now, that is mighty fine. Who would have thought it from such a source?" Jail, "Your conscience, ha, 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 upon your conscience. Well, if that isn't the last thing I ever expected to hear from you. By and by we shall hear courtesans talk of their chastity, rogues of their honesty, and politicians of their disinterestedness. Your conscience, indeed." Bridewell says, "Very well, Dame Jael, you may laugh as much as you please and pretend to sneer at my use of the word conscience. But do not imagine that I meant anything by it. No, madam, conscience with myself, as well as your ladyship, is a word without meaning, and we may as well lay it aside." So you can see the bitter satire going on here. Let's go down a little bit more. Let's see. Let's pick it up. Bridewell, "Prithee now, Dame Jael, do breathe a little and let me talk a while. Your tongue has quite outrun my expectations, although I had given you credit for a swift as well as sharp instrument. It is monstrously unlucky for me, I must own, that I am made the receptacle of the foul things committed to my charge, and especially that so little discrimination should be made between the various grades of offenders. And herein it is I get a bad name." So what he was talking about was that what the jail was talking about is that all kinds of people are thrown in together. You know, he says the youthful offender is placed side by side with the veteran villain, and the miserable maniac, blighted by the finger of Providence, is thrust in with the criminal who is seared by his own wickedness. The petty thief and the daring robber, the excusable homicide and the malicious murderer, the counterfeiter and the victim of counterfeit money, the habitual drunkard and the occasional votary of Bacchus, all thrown together in one mingled mass, the worse still corrupting the better, and the better suffering contamination from the worse, until the whole becomes one entire body of corruption. And then think of the physical condition of your inmates and so on. He also talks about debtor's prison, which he wrote against. Now, when Mathew wrote about and visited the jail in, I think it was around 1855, writing for the Portland Transcript, I've shared that. He talks about the same problem of how people enter jail and by association with criminals there, they get worse instead of better, and so on. Now, this is important. This is Mathew criticizing the jail system in New York City, and in a way, it's amazing he got away with this. He got away with it because he turned it into a kind of an entertaining dialogue. Had he written this as a straight editorial, they would have come down on him. I think it's enough. And this gets printed in the Philadelphia album. Okay, it gets reprinted in the Philadelphia album. So this is pretty edgy social commentary here. Now, there's two things I want to establish. One is that Mathew had visited and written about jails before. He did that in the Constellation, actually, in 1832. He wrote about debtor's prison. But this is something that scholars attribute to Margaret Fuller because they believe that she was the author who wrote in the New York Tribune from 1844 to 1846. There are several instances of the writer signing as a star, visiting jails and insane asylums and so forth and so on. And Margaret Fuller could have accompanied Mathew on one or two of these, but it was Mathew going way back to 1830 that had a really strong interest in social reform with regard to prisons as well as a number of other things. Let's see, I guess I need to keep that pumped up. So what we're going to do here is I'm not going to show the instances of Mathew as the star writing about jails because I think I went into that in my last entry. But let's just look at the style to establish that this is Mathew writing as in this dialogue style, and then we're going to go to something that's attributed mistakenly to Margaret Fuller and see exactly the same style, and we're going to see why it was actually written around the same time in the 1830s. This is a book called The Essayist. It was a young man's magazine. Mathew was in New York City during much of this time, but he came back to the Boston area in 1833. During this period, he was writing a series of 5 books, which were published anonymously in New York, probably published for him by his former editor-in-chief, Asa Green, but they've been mistakenly attributed to Asa Green. None of them were Asa Green's books. One of them is called The Debtor's Prison, A Tale of a Revolutionary Soldier. That was not Asa Green, that was Mathew Franklin Whittier. So this is also Mathew about the same period. This is called Sketches of Character, a Schemer. And there's a quote, "Ne'er was there an idle brain, but bred an idle thought." It's attributed old poem, okay, which is Mathew's sense of humor. So S is for schemer, and F is for Franklin Jr., which is how this is signed. Mathew was using the pseudonym Franklin Jr. Of course, his middle name was Franklin. He very much identified with his namesake, Benjamin Franklin. So he was signing it Franklin Jr. out of respect for Benjamin Franklin. So the schemer says, "You needn't preach to me. I've lived long enough to know a thing or two, and you needn't try to crowd your superstition into me. I don't want anybody to show me how to get along in the world. Give me an equal chance with the rest, and I'll take care of number one." Okay, so this is Mathew speaking to a narcissist, essentially. You could put narcissist instead of schemer, and you get the idea. So F says, "I'm glad I've met you, my young schemer, but you needn't be afraid of my preaching to you. I know a good deal better than to do that. A sound whipping is what you'll want before you'll be properly settled. You talk about having lived long enough to know a thing or two. What's the reason you haven't found out that you are a fool yet? I needn't try to crowd my superstition into you, you say. You wouldn't advise me to put even dirty water into a broken kettle, would you? You don't want anybody to show you how to get along in the world. Of course, you haven't got sense enough to know the utility of advice, but I'll soon show you down my argumentative stairs. You'll take care of number one. You'd better look out to get 1 ounce of sense. Then you may know a little more of yourself and the object of Providence in placing you in this world." And the schemer says, "Providence, you'd advise me to trust her, I suppose, too. I don't believe in that brain-cracked notion. When she pays what she owes already, she'll do well. A fellow has hard work to keep her from knocking on the head everything he undertakes." And then Franklin says, I'll read one more. "She's too apt to bring you up to the chalk, isn't she?" You hint she's in debt. Undoubtedly, she owes you some dozen floggings. But don't be discouraged. She'll be ready to hand over, young man. Whether she expects your foolishness to depart from you or not, she'll show you the pestle and mortar. She's full of deception, you say. It's strange she knows how to manage with snipes like you so well. So he goes on. I mean, this is a philosophical piece. He doesn't have karma. He doesn't have reincarnation, but he has a sense of karmic justice, which is what he's talking about in the name of providence. You could substitute karma for providence here, and you'd about have it. Well, the main thing we're looking at here is style. This is definitely Mathew Franklin Whittier. There's no question whatsoever. I've been through this entire book and vetted it very carefully. Now, we have those two examples of a dialogue, and you get the sense of it. You know, they're philosophical, they're argumentative. They've got one person arguing with another, and they're making a point. This is my copy, because I can't afford an original, of The Dial. This is the Transcendentalist publication that was edited by Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller is supposed to have published with no signature, which was typical protocol for an editor in that day. The editor would not sign. And she's supposed to have written with her last initial F for Fuller. Those were all written by Mathew Franklin Whittier, signing F, just as he had signed Franklin Jr. in the 1833 Essayist, and just as he signed F in 1846 for the Daily Delta, and just as he used F or Franklin in a few other instances scattered here and there, he was signing F in The Dial, and he was doing the reviews. Now, the reviews were the lowest job on a publication or a newspaper or a journal, see? That was the water boy on any publication. Well, Mathew took up the lowest job. He did this in New Orleans for the Daily Delta. He took the lowest job on the paper and he turned it into literature, philosophy and literature. Beautiful pieces signed F in the Daily Delta. You if you want to find them, and you can look up that newspaper, you'll be looking for everything signed F in the summer of 1846 from, I can't remember what the dates are, June through August or something like that. I could be wrong about those dates, but if you look in the summer of 1846, the Daily Delta, look for everything signed with an F. They come from the safety office, I think it's called. That's all Mathew Franklin Whittier, and there's some beautiful pieces. And this is why I say, when Mathew is lost to posterity, not only do they misattribute the famous ones, but they lose the other brilliant stuff that nobody's ever bothered to look at. Okay. So here we have, in the April 1841 edition of The Dial, Volume 1, it's called A Dialogue, Poet, Critic, and it is indeed signed with an F. It's only 3 pages. The other ones in here are like 20 pages or 26 pages or whatever it is. This is way shorter than all the other ones, and there's a reason for that. What has happened is that Abby, Mathew's beloved first wife, his soulmate, died the previous month, March 27, and there was no way that he could write, for the April edition. So what he did, I believe, is he went back to the work that he'd written for the Essayist, in early 1830, 1832, 1833, or maybe even all the way back to 1830. And he took one of his old dialogues that hadn't gotten published, and he just sent it to Margaret Fuller, and she published it. So this is, like 8, 9, 10 years old, this piece. So listen for the same voice here. I'm assuming that the people that are watching this have intuition and enough experience with literature that they can intuit the same voice when they hear it. That's what the whole last installment was about. So this is a poet and a critic. Poet. Remember what these last two sounded like now. Poet. Approach me not, man of cold, steadfast eye and compressed lips. At thy coming, nature shrouds herself in dull mist. Fain would she hide her sighs and smiles, her buds and fruits even in a veil of snow. For thy unkindly breath, as it pierces her mystery, destroys its creative power. The birds draw back into their nests, the sunset hues into their clouds, when you are seen in the distance with your tablets all ready to write them into prose. And the critic answers, O my brother, my benefactor, do not thus repel me. Interpret me rather to our common mother. Let her not avert her eyes from a younger child. I know I can never be dear to her as thou art, yet I am her child, nor would the fated revolutions of existence be fulfilled without my aid. That's what the critic says by way of apology to the poet. Poet, how meanest thou? What have thy measurements, thy artificial divisions and classifications to do with the natural revolutions? In all real growths there is a give and take of unerring accuracy. In all the acts of thy life there is falsity, for all are negative. Why do you not receive and produce in your kind, like the sunbeam and the rose? Then new life would be brought out, were it but the life of a weed, to bear witness to the healthful beatings of the divine heart. But this perpetual analysis, comparison, and classification never add one atom to the sum of existence. Critic says, I understand you. The poet says, yes, that is always the way. You understand me, who never have the arrogance to pretend that I understand myself. Critic, why should you? That is my province. I am the rock which gives you back the echo. I am the tuning key which harmonizes your instrument, the regulator to your watch. Who would speak if no ear heard? Nay, if no mind knew what the ear heard. And the poet says, I'll just read one more. I do not wish to be heard in thought, but in love, to be recognized in judgment, but in life. I would pour forth my melodies to the rejoicing winds. I would scatter my seed to the tender earth. I do not wish to hear in prose the meaning of my melody. I do not wish to see my seed neatly put away beneath a paper label. Answer in new paeans to the soul of our souls. Wake me to sweeter childhood by a fresher growth. At present, you are but an excrescence produced by my life. Depart, self-conscious egotist. I know you not. So this is the same voice. This is Mathew Franklin Whittier. This is not Margaret Fuller. Okay? Now, the very first thing that appears in the first edition of the Dial after Ralph Waldo Emerson's introduction is called A Short Essay on Critics. It's a brilliant essay. This is before Abby died, when I think she was still in relatively good health. It's signed F. This is written by Mathew Franklin Whittier. And I won't read it here, but I would suggest you go and read it yourself with the understanding that it was written by Mathew and not by Margaret Fuller. And it will open up, in a particular sense. It occurs to me as I'm speaking here, thinking that Margaret Fuller had written this material is kind of like what a critic does to poetry. You won't get the real essence of the thing. You get something that's filtered through your understanding of Margaret Fuller. It's like the difference between reading the critique of a poem and immersing yourself in the actual poem. So go back and read A Short Essay on Critics at the very beginning of the Dial with the understanding that it was the same philosopher, humorist, Mathew Franklin Whittier, that was writing it. And I think that's all we have for today. I don't know who's listening. I do see that a lot more people watch these videos if I'm attacking a famous author like Charles Dickens or Edgar Allan Poe. Then we'll look at these videos if I'm talking about Mathew Franklin Whittier and his work. So Mathew is not interesting to nearly as many people as these famous plagiarists are. And none of them are convinced by anything I say. I know that because they don't leave respectful comments and they don't write to me. Okay? So I'm not reaching anybody, near as I can tell. Certainly not anybody that's interested in the famous authors, and not anybody who's skeptical. In time, I might reach them. In 20 years, if they're young, or 30 years, or 40 years, they might read something and say, wait a minute, that crazy guy, that I used to laugh at, that was on YouTube, he said this too. It might kick off some realization, in 20 or 30 or 40 years, or in another lifetime or something. I don't know. It's not getting through now. I wrote about this in my written blog. All this has been in my written blogs recently, which I don't think hardly anybody reads. I submitted my paper, which proves beyond any reasonable doubt that Mathew Franklin Whittier said that Edgar Allan Poe had stolen the Raven from him. I didn't write that paper to prove that he actually had done so. The focus of that paper was, I just want to demonstrate that Mathew Franklin Whittier said that Edgar Allan Poe had done that. And this should be interesting enough to say to oneself, well, who was Mathew Franklin Whittier? And how do you know that that was him? And what else did he write? And a whole host of other questions. You know, it should pique people's interest to want to know more. Instead, they all, I don't know how to put it, they blasted me. They absolutely blasted me and ridiculed me, really. These are reviewers for scholarly journals, you know, that instead of giving the editor an idea of why it should be published or why it shouldn't be published, rational reasons, they just blasted it like they were writing a scathing editorial for a newspaper. See, that's a different kind of review. They call them reviewers, but these are not journalistic reviewers. These are reviewers who are judges to decide whether something should be published or not. And you don't just ridicule somebody as a reason why something shouldn't be published, okay? So these people are not acting professionally at all. Now, you know, one of the things that they will say, the editors will say, is it's not written in a scholarly manner. Well, I told them I'm an independent researcher. I never pretended that I was, you know, in academia. I don't pretend to write the way that scholars do. I don't like the way that scholars write. You know, they use huge words. As I said in my written blog, they use a lot of big words to make a very small point. I'm using ordinary language to make a very big point. So it's exactly the opposite of what they do, and I would not want to emulate them. I have no aspirations of sounding scholarly. Nonetheless, a journal in Victorian literature or Victorian culture or American literature of the 19th century should be interested in a major discovery like Edgar Allan Poe didn't write The Raven, and here's who did it, and here's how I can prove it. You know, even if I was using like third grade vocabulary, they should be interested in that. Okay. And they darn well better give me a citation if they pretend to have discovered it too. See? So I'm really fed up with academia at this point. Mathew was furious with them. And I'm now furious with them, not because Mathew was, but because of my encounters with them. But nonetheless, I've got the goods. I've made the discovery. I can prove it. You know, as I've said many times, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but extraordinary evidence takes time. And any of you, we are now at just about, it's going to be about an hour long, this presentation. If anybody wants to dispute extraordinary claims, they had better be prepared to spend an hour to look at the evidence.